Rethinking EU enlargement. We are still waiting for one of our panelists, but we're going to start because we're on a pretty tight schedule. As you all know, the EU enlargement reports were published this week. They had become, for many years, just a bit of a technical exercise, monitoring the state of progress of the individual countries that really attracted only the attention of a few EU-watching nerds, but now actually there is a public debate, public interest in this debate. And in fact, the audience here needs to know that this event is being recorded. Snippets of these videos might be used in the context of the big EU enlargement forum that the European Commission is organizing that will be held in 2 weeks' time. We also have a global audience of close to 400 people. Welcome to you too, and please do not hesitate to send questions because we will dedicate some time also to addressing questions from the audience. Right. I mentioned earlier there is a public interest in EU enlargement. There is, just going through the motions, new momentum since Russia invaded Ukraine. The process has started with a renewed energy. It's hugely problematic in the sense that it pertains to the future of Europe, but it's also very problematic in several member states. And welcome, Iliriana. You can just go and sit. Yes, here. And it's also fiendishly complicated. So what we want to do here is, just go through what the enlargement reports tell us and then try to analyze some of the outstanding problems with respect to this major project. So we're joined by the Director General of DG Enlargement and Eastern Neighborhood, DG NEST, new name, it used to be called DG NEA, Gert Jan Koopman, who is the policymaker who's really in charge of this major exercise. Iliriana Gjoni is a research analyst here at Carnegie Europe, working on all matters relating to Western Balkans in particular, the growing research interest in culture and foreign policy. Iliriana, I might add, it's not in my bio, but I know this, you are also a professional pianist, so she combines these two identities in one with great style. And then Stefan Lehne, who's a senior fellow here at Carnegie Europe. I think many of you know him. He's been with us since 2012, but prior to that, Austrian diplomat, the Director General for Europe at the Austrian Foreign Ministry, but also a member of Solana's team when Javier Solana was the High Representative for Foreign Policy. So he's really been engaged in firefighting and rebuilding the Balkans since Europe was engaged, since the EU was engaged with that. Right, I don't want to take up any more time, so I'm going to turn to Gert Jan Koopman and just ask you to give us, in pill-sized sound bites, a quick summary of the reports. What are the main messages that you want to share with us? What is the good news and what is the bad news?
Thank you very much. Great to be here. So the key messages, I think first message, unprecedented momentum, arguably the most progress made across candidate countries in the past 15 years. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we're now seeing a group of frontrunners having formulated deadlines for completing the negotiations, which the Commission assesses as realistic, and these deadlines are not in the far future. Montenegro aims to end the technical negotiations by the end of next year, Albania end of 27, Moldova and Ukraine in 28. What is really important is that we assess these ambitions as realistic based on the track record of these countries over the past year. We agreed with Montenegro and Albania planning, which, let me reveal to you, when we did it last year in August, I wasn't so sure that they were actually going to make it, this being the Western Balkans, but actually they have delivered meticulously, and therefore, based on this experience, we consider it's really realistic that they end by the end of next year and to the end of 2027, respectively. So that is really great. We see also, unfortunately, that and I'll come back to that the Council is finding it difficult to take decisions on Ukraine and Moldova. And this is concerning because the enlargement process is based on own merits and it's very strict, no geopolitical discounts, but it's also based on the assumption that we reciprocate and that if countries meet the criteria, that then they can actually advance. So this is going to be a bit of a challenge going forward. What we also highlight is that the reflection on how we integrate them needs to start in earnest. That is a matter of money, but also of what the rules will be in the accession treaties. And here we have indicated that we want to see stronger safeguards going forward, because I think more than ever before, enlargement is of geostrategic importance, and therefore we want the countries to be adding strength to the EU, not taking risks going forward. Linked to that, we also signal that enlargement is more than ever before a geostrategic choice. And this means that the alignment with our common foreign and security policy, which traditionally had to be reached at the end of the negotiations, is actually something we want to see progressing much more rapidly, and we will be attaching importance to it. Now, the not so good news is that for a few countries, it's been a very difficult year for varying reasons, mostly domestic politically. And we very much hope that this momentum is going to lead to them catching up. And we've seen a very sad case of backsliding in the case of Georgia, which really seems to have lost its way, and where we essentially say that we consider this country a candidate country in name only. So, the landscape has changed dramatically, and in many ways, the moment of truth is now arriving for us as well. We have not published on the same day the policy reviews, which are being worked on. They will come. Don't worry. But with those policy reviews, all the ingredients will be on the table, and Council will need to then rise to the challenge and the opportunity at the same time. So I think next year is going to be a fascinating year for EU enlargement policy, and we approach it with a lot of energy and a lot of momentum in our candidate countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You made several points, and I do want to pick up on them for the discussion, but I'd first like to bring in our other speakers. And I would like to start with Iliriana. I mean, you mentioned the unexpected progress from Montenegro and Albania. So at what point did the enlargement prospects become credible again? And how were these reports received in the Western Balkan region?
Exactly. I think it's a question where the answer depends very much on the countries which we are talking about. Obviously, if we talk about Montenegro and Albania, all of the societies, not only on the government side, are very happy to see that the countries are progressing. And there is obviously momentum in both cases. Maybe Albania has been the one that has taken a little bit more the spotlight this year because it has opened 5 out of the 6 clusters. We are expecting the opening of the last cluster this year. On the other hand, Montenegro was at that point more advanced, and we will have closing of chapters because Montenegro obviously has already had a positive assessment on the IBAR, of the interim benchmarks assessment report. So both of these countries, I think we have a positive sentiment. And what's important after this enlargement package was published is that between the lines, I think everybody can read the political will is there on the side of the EU. I think this is very clear. And even I think the oppositions in these countries, the CSOs, the ones that are most aware about the issues that obviously are still active in both of them, are happy to see that there is momentum, and I think there will be more space going forward also for them to contribute even more significantly, so that the democracy processes are robust and sustainable. Now, going beyond the 2 countries, obviously, Serbia has been not a very positive report this year, and however, I think at large we have seen more the earnest or the most sincere assessment on Serbia, because obviously the protests that have been ongoing for the past year, they have been mentioned in the report, and there hasn't been this kind of under the radar, moving ahead with the situation. I think the region, not only Serbia, is happy to notice that these things are being acknowledged. However, I was surprised a little bit to see the stark difference in the grade that Serbia versus Kosovo got, because I think all of us who work on this region and especially travel to Kosovo, etc., we notice that the state of the society, because this is a grade which is given not only to the elites, but also to the society and the institutions. I think that the way that I have found the peace in myself to read this grade is that it's a grade of all the stakeholders on, let's say, the accession process of Kosovo, because obviously it's not only dependent on Kosovo what happens on the EU accession process that it has ahead. Obviously, there is EU on the one side. I think I'm one of the optimists there, because during this past year where we had such protests in Serbia, I thought that there would be an opening for the Commission to get a little bit more creative and maybe try and work more in the north. As somebody who is part of this think tank, we have done study trips also to North Mitrovica. We have spoken to Serb stakeholders in the north who actually were relieved that the Srpska lista, the Serb list, was no longer in power on the one side. Obviously, the resolution or the solution of the situation in the north is not yet there, but I think there would have been more space to do something in that moment. On the other hand, now with the return of the Srpska lista and with President Vučić potentially looking for ways to distract, it doesn't need to get to a situation, I hope it doesn't get to a situation like Banjska, but to distract from the internal situation in Serbia. I am afraid that the next 4 years will not allow for the EU and the Commission to kind of move ahead with Kosovo. Now, I understand some, I think, messages, political messages are being sent at highest level, but as I mentioned, I think it's important to acknowledge that society at large in Kosovo has a peaceful state, has had multiple elections that have continued in a regular pace, and even if they don't have a government at the moment, here in Brussels, sometimes it's 500 days or more without a government, but the country can still function with a caretaker government. I think there would have been ways. And finally, Bosnia, obviously a country which I don't think for them this was really an event. I think there's a lot to deal internally. And North Macedonia, well, they have engaged with a growth plan, and I think there are the remarks also speak of this continued engagement, but there is no genuine, let's say, exchange on the matters which have blocked the way forward for North Macedonia, which is the bilateral issues. And we are kind of seeing the repercussions or the skepticism among the population that right now, let's say, is looking maybe at Albania and Montenegro in a way, oh, you are believing it that you will get there. But I think this could go in a good way as well, in the sense when Montenegro and Albania do make it, then I think this skepticism in North Macedonia maybe will have a potential to also diffuse and move ahead.
Thank you very much. I think so differential treatment and the countries that are not making progress for accession is perhaps something that we could also discuss later. But I'd first like to turn to Stefan Lehne, who, among other things, is also the co-author, together with Zoran Nechev and Richard Greason, of a report that we published 2 months ago, or maybe end of August, on this idea of gradual accession, which is really a recognition of the problems that this whole enlargement project poses, and some, identifying the complexity of the problem and trying to find some practical solutions to go about it. So, Stefan, can you perhaps say a few words about that?
I think what we've seen now in the enlargement package is a good plan, basically. It's a whole sequence of events. You first go for the low-hanging fruits for Montenegro and Albania, try to prove that enlargement is still alive, hoping that their accession will send a very positive, encouraging signal to the to the laggards. At the same time, you work very hard, first informally and hopefully after the elections in Hungary, formally on the big issue, which is the integration of Ukraine. But like most human plannings, much can go wrong, right? Even in Montenegro, you have a very fractious politics, basically. Serbia has a lot of influence. If Vučić is still around, he can try to create a mess. I think Albania has governance issues. I think the report recognizes this. It also has a rather complex reputational problem, despite all the progress that has been achieved lately. And then there's the big problem of ratification. I think the average time needed for ratifying enlargement agreements over the last 7 enlargements was 14 months. I've met very few people who think this can be done the same way this time. I think we have to recognize that Europe has become a lot more fragmented, basically. Radical right parties have moved up. Rosa, we have published about this. Some of them are vehemently anti-European, they're anti-enlargement. If you look at Germany and France, such parties are leading in the polls at the moment. So to expect that the ratification process will go very smoothly I think it's very difficult to envisage that. And then in France, you have a particular problem. You have to have a referendum, or you have to have 3/5 majority in both chambers, which I think will be very difficult to achieve. And this makes me say that in this new age, basically, geopolitical challenges as never before, internal fragmentations and divisions, enlargement needs to be much more robust and resilient than it has been before. And the main instrument to do this is gradual integration. And we think that gradual integration basically has 3 basically purposes. The first one is to function as a motor of the enlargement process. I think, of course, accession is a big carrot, right? But for some of these countries, this carrot is so far over the horizon that it's sort of a small orange spot somewhere out there that has no pulling power anymore, really, or hardly any. Therefore, if you need to slice the carrot, and if you give parts of the benefits of enlargement early on, conditioned on very concrete reform steps and supported by very targeted financing, you get things moving. And therefore, I'm very happy that the report has gives a lot of space to gradual integration, even though I believe it more reflects what the Commission is already doing, and I hope it will do a great deal more in the future. The second function is to act as an insurance policy, because I think, in Albania and Montenegro, people say, let's waste time on gradual integration. It's pointless. We go for the big thing. We have to devote all energy to these objectives. And I think this would be a very bad mistake because of the political risks that are involved in this process, that they can't do much to control them by themselves. So one of the proposals we make is that if a country has closed a cluster, and if the Commission and the Council come to the conclusion that this is ready for implementation, there will be no need for transitional periods in this area, why not actually have the country participate in this policy and participate and observe in the relevant work of the Council? If that happens, and of course it's quite ambitious to do this, but that would radically reduce the risk for the ratification process, because then the countries would not be sort of parked for maybe years and years and years. The EU agreement with Canada, trade agreement with Canada, was signed in 2016. That has not been ratified now. So, of course, this is a special case. Enlargement is different. One can hope it works more positively, but there is no guarantee for that. So the insurance policy is the second element. And the third one is gradual integration can work as a safety net for those who will not make it. Because I think nobody in this room believes that all these 10 countries will end up members of the European Union. But they will still be in Europe, and they will still be important partners of the European Union. And I think it would make perfect sense also for these countries, such as maybe Turkey, to be integrated in parts of the internal market with the relevant safeguards, with the relevant conditions and all that. So I think that sectoral gradual integration turning into sectoral integration on the basis of reversibility, on the basis of the right rule of law standards, is an option for countries that have not made it. And the EU, with the EEA and the Swiss agreement, has shown it was fairly good in dealing with failed candidates. I think it will also have some need to do this in the future. So I think for all these reasons, if you want a sort of resilient, robust enlargement process under the very difficult circumstances of today, you need to upgrade gradual integration and to push this very hard and to exploit the potential to the fullest.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'd like to turn to you all for a second round of questions, and then I'd like to open it up. So, please put your thinking caps on. So there were a few points that were raised in the discussion. I mean, the first thing, maybe just a couple of words also on Ukraine, Moldova. After all, that has been really the engine that has set this momentum going, with a much stronger focus on the geopolitical dynamic as opposed to the transformative dynamic, which was very much what was driving what became the Big Bang enlargement in 2004. Secondly, the differential treatment of countries, or at least what is perceived. You probably will disagree with my use of differential treatment. But I think, the fact Serbia, just a few days ago, it was the anniversary of the collapse of the Novi Sad bus station, which has sparked huge protests across the country. And these are not protests that are carried out in the name of Europe. So there's a bit of a difference, contrast with, for instance, the Euromaidan protests in 2014. How can Europe sort of deal with this, and how can you engage with civil society, keep the engagement with the governments, because that is what the EU does. How can the EU look at these contradictions or these competing goals? And I turn to you first, and then I'm going to turn to the others as well. Just be brief, because I do want to open it up.
Very good. Well, maybe first on Ukraine and Moldova, it's important we talk about that, as you rightly said, because that was the trigger for this renewed momentum. And effectively, by the end of this month, we will not only have completed the screening process for these countries, which actually was already completed at the end of last month, but we will also have sent all of the relevant paperwork, not just the screening reports, but the draft common positions and the positions of these countries to the Council. That really is unprecedented. And as I said, we are very strict when it comes to the own merits principle. So, we're already saying that the first three clusters for these countries we're ready to be opened in the summer. We will now say that all of the clusters can be opened by the end of this year. And we all know that there is the Hungarian problem relating to Ukraine, but I think the moment of truth in the East is coming rapidly. And what is important here is that we find a way forward to ensure that the reform momentum is sustained. Clearly, I don't think it is realistic to assume that the enlargement methodology is going to be changed in the next a year or two, given the Hungarian position. But what we need to do is to ensure that the reform momentum and the guidance that the countries need from the member states is provided. So that actually, for me, is one of the biggest challenges we have. And it's also a challenge of credibility for the EU. Now, you already rightly predicted that I would not agree with saying that we have a differential treatment. I think we are strict but fair across the piece. You of course, are fully entitled to disagree with this. But the situations are in the Western Balkans are really very different across the countries. And I think what you see in this report is the Commission also very clearly signaling that we work with the whole of society, because enlargement has to be a whole of society process. When it comes to Serbia, Serbia is, you all know this, of course, is about 50%, 55% of the economy of the Western Balkans. And whatever we may think of Mr. Vucic's government, I think the events of this year have been a wake-up call for everyone in the region and also for the government. We are passing a very straightforward message. The calls of the demonstrators for more democracy, for fighting corruption, for freedom of media and press, are actually what we in our Eurospeak call the fundamentals. And it is a bit disappointing that no one is waving a European flag. You might say that this is because the EU has been working with Mr. Vučić, and therefore the EU is not seen as a credible actor in these debates. But we need to recenter this debate on what the EU really is about. And the fundamentals are our identity. That's the EU DNA. So what we have been doing over the past weeks, I would say months, is trying to work intensively with civil society, with a constructive opposition, that is the non-pro-Russian opposition, and the government to try to bring them together, because there is no way out without all these parties focusing on what really matters. And whether you put an EU stamp on it or not is actually of secondary importance. So it's not easy for none of them. And I've done many different things in my career in the Commission. I have seldom seen people of goodwill, intelligent people on all sides of the spectrum finding it so difficult to work together and feeling compromised by working together. And that's a bad thing. However, the good news is that probably tomorrow we will see a very important law passed in Serbia on the REM Council, which actually will, for the first time, see civil society having a blocking minority in the media supervision. This is not unimportant. And secondly, also the cleanup of the voters' registry will be passed. We have offered, and then I'll stop on Serbia, to take the work on the fundamentals, which are critical to the interim benchmark work forward through an EU platform for reforms where we want to have everyone around the table. We've told the government we want everyone around the table. It's not possible to advance without doing that. And it's very difficult, but we hear from all the actors that reluctantly, provided we are there, they're willing to do that. So I don't want to give up on that country. I don't want to give up on any of the countries. I don't want to give up on Kosovo either. Let me be very clear. The problem with Kosovo is that absent a government, it is very hard to negotiate enlargement. Let us be honest. You can do lots of things. You can have a caretaker government doing lots of things, but the sort of things that we needed to do, unfortunately, were simply impossible in the present circumstances. But I very much wish that we can sustain the momentum of how shall I say, peaceful transition that we now see in the north of the country, to get to a point where we can actually start the work on screening the country's membership application, which has been sitting there for 3 years, which is awful. It's awful. We need to move forward on that. So that will require a lot of flexibility on our side, but we will definitely double down on it. And I think you already see that the laggards, including North Macedonia, and here I have to disagree with you, this is not a bilateral issue. This is whether we agree or not about the wisdom of including certain elements in the negotiating framework. It is in the negotiating framework. North Macedonia has to change the constitution and has privileged domestic policies over changing the constitution. That is regrettable. That's why we have lost a year. But I think we will now see all these countries looking at each other and seeing that Montenegro and Albania are actually racing towards the finish line. And therefore my optimism about the momentum is, I don't think it's naive. You actually see it happening. It's impossible to sustain the argument that they will not be able to get there. They will get there. Final point on gradual integration. It's really very important, and I actually agree with pretty much everything that Stefan said here. We have already, and we should be clear about this, both in the East and in the Western Balkans, moved very, very significantly on integrating these countries, not in the way he proposed, where they would actually be participating formally in sectoral parts of the EU. But if you look across transport, energy, industrial goods, payment systems, visa, and I can go on for a while, you actually will see these countries already today as a very significantly integrated part of our system. And we will take this further, not as an alternative to accession. I think we should be very, very careful not to portray it that way, but simply as a way of accelerating accession and in the process offering, I think you call it a safety net, an insurance policy. We can have many different labels on it. So I've been pushing this very aggressively through the new generation of financial instruments, the growth plans, The Commission President has been advocating it. And what we see is that a lot of the private sector investments that we now see going to the region are actually looking at this gradual integration as evidence, hard evidence, that their investments are going to be investments in a region that is EU-oriented. So that also provides a bit of optimism.
Iliriana, very quickly, can I ask you, this momentum, Montenegro and Albania, and at the beginning when this idea started to take shape, lots of people are wondering, are they big enough to be sort of, to act as swing states and persuade the rest of the Western Balkans to move? What do you think? I mean, in the past 6 months, have you seen the impact of the fact that they are negotiating on the other countries?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, whenever we have meetings, not only here in Brussels, but also in the region, it is a point of reference, the fact that we see, for instance, Albania having mobilized such a power behind the process and really step by step going through all the necessary administrative alignments, etc. It shows that when you do the work, indeed, you can move ahead. However, Albania has a significantly easier job in some ways because it's free of these ethnic tensions, which in a certain degree plague all the political spectrums of the other countries. Even Montenegro, though it's small, it's 600,000 people. I am a native of Montenegro. I'm Albanian from there, and between the Montenegrin versus Serb population, the difference is 33 to 34% more or less. So whatever happens, this is another element actually which is important to mention. Whatever happens with the EU process in a country like Montenegro is extremely magnified. If it's good, it's magnified for the good, but if it's bad, it's magnified for the bad. And when something like that happens in the region, I think the messaging spreads very quickly across the Balkans. So I think it's quite important for the EU to have these successes and to continue really engaging. As a person who works on the file, I've been also critical on things that happened, especially in the past year. My hometown has been a designate of potentially UAE investments for luxury resorts with huge environmental repercussions and potentially also displacement of a minority people from this part of the country. I've been critical on the fact that Montenegro has closed this procurement chapter, which is in the UAE-Montenegro deal, word to word, basically going against the acquis communautaire. However, I see in this kind of situations a potential for the EU to step into the next phase of the process, which would be, okay, they want to continue with this momentum. It's important not to lose it. I think then we can send people to the region, have more secondments, have more awareness of the things that are happening on the ground before such big decisions are taken. Because the negotiations or the agreements on this deal, for instance, was a 30-minute WhatsApp communication, etc. I think this kind of issues, because in the big picture, Montenegro wants to be part of the EU. It has wanted to be part of the EU for decades, and I think this is what they care more about. I think with this kind of deeper engagement from the EU, from the member states, in a country which is small and doesn't require a lot of money or people to have an effect, locking, so to say, the transformation, the transformative power of the EU could have, of course, a wave of positive effects across the rest of the Western Balkans.
Thanks. And Iliriana is preparing a paper precisely on these real estate investments in the Western Balkans. Stefan, can we just turn on? I think you had a comment, or okay, you do, but can I also ask you a question? Can we just turn the gaze towards the European Union, because you and I travel, we spend time in Brussels, and we get the energy here, and then you go to Berlin and Paris, talk about enlargement, and you get depressed. I mean, they're quite different worlds, really. The debate is very different. So I'm just wondering, turning to the member states and turning to the difficulties in the Council, what are your impressions? How do you see this problem in terms of credibility for the EU?
Well, I think the Commission clearly is in the lead on this issue, has always been in the lead of issue in a very complicated, slightly schizophrenic situation. On the one hand, the prosecutor, and on the other, the defense lawyer for the countries. And obviously tried to keep the issue alive in a fairly hostile context, basically. And I think the opinion polls show there is support for enlargement, but if you look more closely, it's very thin support, and it's certainly not a priority for normal European citizens. So and there are big divisions, and there are also conflicts of interest. I think there are countries that are very, very determined that Ukraine comes in very quickly. I think with Ukraine, you have obviously a massive clash between the geopolitical imperative of reaching quick results in order to save this country, basically, and the time that is needed to meet the very stringent conditions of EU membership. This tension, I think, will be there from the beginning to the end, and there will be countries that will push very hard, because whether the Ukraine makes it or not will decide, maybe to some extent, whether the husbands join the wives or the wives join the husbands. So it's absolutely critical and crucial. And I cannot imagine that that Ukraine will join exactly on the basis of the methodology that we have had for the last many years. I think there have to be a certain amount of creativity to make this really happen. And the problem is, of course, there are other countries like my own Austria that insist very much that everything that happens for Ukraine has also to happen for the Western Balkans. So you will have tensions in this regard. So altogether, I believe for most Europeans, this is not a high priority. I think Ukraine is something that people sort of understand something has to be done. At the same time, it's also the most scary candidate. So I think that winning a referendum in France on Ukrainian accession, I think, is an uphill struggle. So I do believe that the kind of support from the member states, they will have to do a lot. I think the commissioners will have to do a lot of convincing to align them all in moving ahead in the way that Mr. Koopman has outlined for us here.
Thank you, Stefan. And now I'd like to open the conversation to members of the audience. If anybody would like to put their hand up, great. We have a question over there. We have a microphone roaming, and okay, we also have some online, lots online. So please, and can I ask you to introduce yourself?
My name is Vishni Bacjanovic, and I'm here from UN Women, United Nations Entity for Gender Equality. I'm also Serbian, which is less relevant here. I just, of course, wanted to bring to our attention that gender equality is also part of EU fundamentals, but also that gender inequality or social norms are part of social fiber in the region, and that without addressing gender inequalities, there is no social transformation needed for sustainable accession, or the other way around as well. And that having that in mind, this organized or structured gender backlash is also a huge threat to the process. And also a reminder to all of us that we need really to take gender equality agenda very seriously, also to find alternative solutions, because it needs to be deeper, ensuring not only adoption of legislation, but also its implementation. So I just wanted to again advocate for strengthening of gender equality agenda in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to group a few questions because for reasons of time. So does anyone else have a question here? Okay, Michael Emerson and Federico Baccini, please. Michael, just here at the front. Oh, there we go. Thank you. And then Federico, and then I have a couple here too.
I'm Michael Emerson from SEPS down the road. I have a question for the Director General on the question of safeguards. Of course, the treaty has, in principle, a very important safeguard. I think it's Article 7, but that hasn't been used because it requires unanimity of all but the states. Now, is it possible legally to reform that article to switch the decision-making on Article 7 to qualified majority, in which case the problem could be solved? Another question was the prospect of Montenegro coming in and the old question of the number of commissioners, which will become increasingly acute as the enlargement process advances. There is the provision in the treaty, as you know, to limit the number of commissioners to 2/3 of the number of member states. Isn't it about time that the debate about using that could be opened up again?
Federico Baccini for the New Union Post. Director General Commissioner Costa, said on Tuesday, that the Commission is working with the Danish presidency to get a mandate from the Council to continue the work with Ukraine and Moldova, despite the veto from Budapest, to work on a working level with the two candidates. Are the talks already ongoing with the Council, and do all members of the Council need to agree on this potential solution? An unrelated question: when do we have to expect the communication on the on the reforms, on the reviews?
Okay, can you cope with 2 more questions? Yeah. So they're 2 quite specific ones. I've got some more as well, but they're a bit more general, so I'll keep them for later. One is on Moldova, the current dialogue with the Transnistrian authorities. Are they open, forthcoming? Are they willing to comply to EU requirements? And the other is, again, on the Serbia-Kosovo question, and the sort of what I was calling, the treatment. The online question is actually, how does the EU justify appeasing Belgrade while still sanctioning Kosovo and mentioning the reported abduction of a Serbian citizen from Kosovo, and other events in this ongoing bilateral issue? So I think you need to start. You have several things. I've made a note in case you need reminding.
I apologize beforehand. I will have to shoot off in a few minutes, but let me pick up on all of these very interesting questions. I'm not going to elaborate too much on gender, other than to say that I fully agree with you. This is actually really, 50% of the people in the Western Balkans are women, and culturally there are a few challenges around. Although when I negotiate with the Albanians, I sometimes feel in a minority gender-wise, but we'll leave it at that. Now, coming to Michael's points, I think that the question of whether we immediately need to change the number of commissioners is going to be dependent on whether on the shape of the next enlargement. Are we going to be talking about 1, 2, 3? I don't think we're going to be looking at a big bang, but assume we take in Montenegro in 28. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but assume we were to do that, I don't think this is absolutely necessary. Personally, I think that the question of the number of commissioners is going to be on the table, together with a few other institutional questions that we have been debating for quite a while. If we're looking at a cohort of new member states. On the safeguards, Article 7, I think the key issue here is how far can we go under Article 49? So how far can we push the accession treaties to build safeguards? And I think the legal limit is that you cannot use Article 49 to change the treaty. Then you need to use Article 48. So it is possible, of course, to have a new generation of accession treaties as we propose, and alongside change the treaty. But it's going to be a tall order to get all of that through Council. What we have observed, and this is a purely empirical observation from my side, is that the appetite to use Article 7 is limited. And I think the appetite to change the rules on decision-making on Article 7, which will have to be decided by unanimity, is therefore even lower. So I don't see that as very likely, which means that we need to concentrate on the accession treaties. And I think there's much more we can do with accession treaties than we have done before. And that is definitely going to be necessary given the geopolitical context, given what Stefan has been saying about the landscape in the member states. And I fully agree with him. This is going to be ultimately our biggest challenge. And actually, if I look at the way I use the resources in the DG, I'm shifting significant resources, both financial and human resources, to this engagement and outreach strategy. Massively so, I would say. It's a bit at the limit of what my DG does. It's at the limit of what we have done in the past, but it's absolutely necessary. So this is going to be the key challenge. That's obvious. Now, Moldova, Transnistria. There has been a very difficult moment. There was a very difficult moment earlier this year when Russia tried to blackmail Transnistria, use Transnistria to blackmail the rest of the country, the right bank, by cutting off energy supplies. We managed for once to act very, very quickly and offered the Transnistrians gas. So we bought gas for them. And much to my satisfaction, there were European flags in Transnistria. Then the gas started flowing very rapidly again. We had a wonderful insurance policy. We had enough money in the kitty to buy new gas, but Russia didn't want a repeat of European flags in Transnistria. So it's one of the cheapest interventions I managed to engineer in my career. We only spent 10 million euros, and Transnistria had a relatively okay winter afterwards. I think what I would also say is that we've had very significant discussions in that context with the Moldova authorities and representatives of the Transnistrian region. In that context, so we have something to build on, and I think if we look at the trade patterns of the Transnistrian region, they're actually more oriented towards the EU today than the trade patterns of the right bank of the country. So this issue will have to be addressed. It will have to be addressed relatively quickly, and we are very focused on it. You had a question about
negotiating mandate. Oh no, sorry, Serbia-Kosovo.
Serbia-Kosovo. Inequality of treatment. So let me say on Kosovo, the issue here that has kept a lot of people very busy is the measures, which effectively have significantly curtailed the financial support. We worked hard last year to lift those measures, but this is a decision ultimately that the Council needs to take. So in the end, the Council was not prepared to lift the measures. It was prepared to propose gradual lifting of the measures, which the EU would execute, and the Council would remain seized. You should read this wording. It's a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise. So we have been gradually lifting the measures, conditional on sustained de-escalation in the north. And now that this de-escalation has been sustained, also through the local elections, and provided it continues with the orderly transfer of power to the new mayors, we intend to take a very big step, and we have recommended on that basis for these measures to be fully lifted. But we can already take a very big step, and that's definitely something we're planning to do. I think honestly, the way forward here is to work with both countries. The dialogue, unfortunately, has not delivered very much in the past year. The situation has not gotten worse. Maybe that is the upside. But I happen to believe that the EU path of both countries is the only way of successfully getting to a de facto implementation of the Ohrid agreements, because the appetite on both sides to work together is unfortunately to date rather limited.
Okay, now I'm not sure whether you can stay for an extra 5 minutes or whether you need to. Okay, because I'd like to see if there are more questions in the audience. And sorry, yeah, you didn't answer. Oh yes, it's true, the negotiating mandate.
Yeah.
You agreed to stay.
The negotiating mandate.
That now.
Your question on the negotiating mandate was what exactly again? Okay. Yeah. So the issue here is that since March, no, I'm exaggerating, since April, under the Polish presidency, we have actually been sending papers to the Council, even if, those papers were not finally endorsed, and the Council working group has been looking at them. The issue that is now being looked at is whether we can take that process forward. Actually, the Commission doesn't really need a mandate for that, because the Commission can send documents to the Council, and we will send these documents to the Council, whatever happens. Our report is very clear about that. The issue is whether the Presidency has enough leeway to take those discussions forward in the Council and to do something with it. One thing is to discuss in a working group, that's great, but ultimately a discussion in a working group is a discussion in a working group. What we need, what the countries need, we Commission as negotiators and the countries as recipients of guidance from the EU, is a position of the largest number possible of member states. And I think that is a little bit what we're discussing today.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience? I have a few online. So, okay, please. And yeah.
My name is Jaap Visser. I've been working at the Council for about 37 years. I guess you were a colleague there too. You were at the Commission, Gert Jan, in a lower position than the Director General. Congratulations, the present position. The question is about Ukraine. Since the Russian aggression started, and I took in my house refugees, 8 in total, and 2 are still there. And they worry about the prospect for becoming a member of the European Union. They want to be there within 5 years, and they don't see it feasible. Can you reassure them?
So maybe if you could take this, and then you can leave, and we can finish off with the other set of questions.
Yeah. No, well, listen, I think we need to be clear. What we can realistically reassure them of is that the reforms that will modernize their country and that will make it a truly European country can be completed over the next years by 2028. That, I think, is feasible if they sustain the momentum. And it's a very, very major achievement to have gotten to the point where we are today, honestly. It really is quite something to negotiate with people who sit in a bunker. I mean, that is not something that I have experienced very often in my career. And they still sustain the reforms. They will need to sustain them for much longer, and it will get only harder because this is the easy bit. When we actually start going further down the road, a lot will need to be done. And obviously, we were just discussing this informal process. There are limits to the informal process. At the end of the day, we need the 27 to decide to close chapters, and that we in the Commission cannot guarantee. But what we can guarantee is that the reforms are done. And I think, Marta Kos has a great line on this, which I want to repeat. The country is not going to be stopped doing the existential reforms because Viktor Orban doesn't want it to happen. This is something countries can do, and we can help them, and we are prepared to be, how shall I say, very creative in helping them to undertake the reforms. Ultimately, it will then be for the member states, all 27, to decide whether that is enough and whether they can be let in. And I think it would be wrong of anyone in this room to give them a guarantee that that will happen. We cannot guarantee that. But we can get them to a place that is infinitely better than they've been before. And I think that is not a bad thing to aim for.
Thank you for being with us. Continue, but thank you very much for coming. And I'm going to continue with the next set of questions, which actually Director General wouldn't have been able to answer them, right? So, because they're actually about the future of the EU. And one of the questions are we going to witness a gradual enlargement, or are EU member states contemplating a fully fledged membership for the candidate countries? And Stefan, I'm looking towards you. I think you have the answer to that. But also, again, in terms of EU reform, is EU enlargement without a reform of the institutions possible? And here I'd like to encourage you to be a bit provocative. I've kind of been saying that the fact that EU reform has been framed as a necessary precondition for enlargement is actually a deviation from the historical path in which actually the EU enlarged and then reformed, or the two happened at the same time. So I'd like to encourage both of you. And I think maybe start with Stefan, because, yeah.
Well, I think this enlargement deepening debate is many decades old. It has accompanied just about every enlargement. And ultimately, one of the major problems has been that the countries who want enlargement are also the ones who want reforms, right? So, and the countries who are not so keen on enlargement don't want the reforms. Therefore, in terms of leverage, actually, and getting it done, this was never strong enough, right? And ultimately, if you look at the history of the European Union, lots of reforms happened, but very few were really driven by the enlargement argument. I think many were driven by the internal market, by the need to do something about migration, to do something about the rule of law. There are many issues that drove reforms forward, but enlargement was never one of the most critical ones. I think right now the mood in the member states is such that a major reform is not to be had. Basically, I think the majority of member states don't want treaty change because they think it's not going to work. We will have tons of referendums that will go wrong. So everything that has to be done has to be done in the framework of the Lisbon Treaty. I think Mr. Koopman pointed out very clearly the accession treaties cannot be used to change the EU treaty as such. That gives a lot of limit to what actually can be done. I think we're going to have a discussion about the size of the Commission, about more qualified majority voting, and a number of other issues, but none, I would be very surprised if a drastic, radical reform that I would think is necessary for other reasons too, will actually be feasible in the context of the enlargement debate. I think that the idea at the moment that enjoys the strongest support is that you can, within the accession treaty, have rules that would be valid only for the acceding countries, that would limit their basically potential for troublemaking. There is the idea, I think, that comes also out of the SEPS report, that for a certain period of time, these countries would not enjoy full veto rights. There is an idea that you could have a rule of law conditionality that is much broader than the one that is agreed in the regulation, which links it to financial interests of the Union. That, I think, can be done. But the question is how far you can go, because I'm sure Albania and Montenegro wouldn't have much problems with foregoing the right of a veto for a period of 10 years, because they're not going to use it anyway. But I don't think it's an option for Ukraine. I think if Ukraine becomes a member, it would see itself as one of the leading EU countries, basically. Tens of thousands of citizens have died basically to defend Europe. I don't think they will be interested in a sort of truncated memberships that doesn't give them full participation in decision making. But I think this idea of having rules in the accession treaties that limit the risk of backsliding, massive backsliding, like we witnessed in Hungary and in Poland under peace, I think we're very likely to see that, because I think the Commission and everybody will understand that without this, ratification of accession treaties has no chance.
Iliriana, do you think not having full membership rights would be acceptable for Montenegro and for Albania?
Well, we have heard from both of these countries. Montenegro was very clear that it's not interested in this kind of membership, that it would want to assert its veto rights as well from the beginning. Albania has considered the option of not having veto rights. However, I think what's important here is also that we, as the EU, have a constructive way of communicating, a strategic communication which is very clear on the fact that this is a transitionary period, that it precedes full membership. The way you say things is sometimes very important, because I think the moment when you speak of gradual integration, but don't make it clear that it's going to lead to full membership, especially for the countries which are closer to acceding, I think is the moment where they disengage, and we lose this kind of mobilization that we see from the countries which are the front runners. I also wanted to touch on something that was mentioned before on the member states, and I think it's valid to consider maybe EU-wide that there would be a lot of power to be mobilized also on the side of culture, because I think, as Stefan mentioned, reputation. I myself went through this integration personally. It's very challenging to integrate in the EU as a non-EU member. There's a lot of prejudice towards citizens of the Balkans, and it's very important to see what of that is true and what is not true. And for instance, in the Netherlands, they had this experience of this travel show where people organized filming across Albania, and it has completely changed, let's say, the perception of this country. Many Dutch tourists now fly multiple times a week to Albania, and I think this starts creating that window in the minds of the member state citizens that there's something to discover. And obviously, because it's not easy to integrate, sometimes there is part of society, in every society, but also in these societies, that they use sinister ways, let's say, to become part of the EU. And I think we need to discover in which ways we can unlock, so to say, the world of creativity to reinforce positive messaging around the enlargement process.
Thanks. I'm going to ask just one final, but you're just going to give me, really short answers. 2030, Rama campaigns to be re-elected, and 2030, Albania is going to be in the European Union. So which countries do you think might be in the EU in 2030, and which countries in 2035? Iliriana.
Well, I would definitely think Montenegro, Albania, Moldova. Some say Iceland, who knows? Okay. But I would go for a broader ticket, definitely, rather than a limited one.
I agree, partly. I think possibly in Ukraine you might have some kind of membership with a lot of the implementation of the acquis communautaire left to later, basically. Because there might be sort of a political need to do something important just to stabilize the situation and to overcome a potential huge problem.
Well, thank you very much. I'm mindful of the time. Our clock actually says it's 7:35. It's 6:35 in Brussels, but thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you also for Director General Koopman, who was here earlier. I did not grant him the applause because he left, but now we can do it in his absence. And thank you all for joining us.